Welcome to Section 38, where we're going to wrap up our discussion on other CBP requirements by talking about the importer security filing. Really what we've been doing when we talk about ocean manifests and air manifests and now importer security filing is all the things that need to happen before a customs entry can be submitted. Once we finish up this section, we're going to get into that entry process in detail. Let's run through this, and then we'll get into that entry process. In addition to requirements like carrier manifests, CBP enforces what is called importer security filing, or ISF. Second bullet, ISF is also known as ISF 10+2, which was a name that came from the original requirements of the importer security filing. To understand where that came from, a very brief history lesson is necessary, and we'll do that in our third bullet point. ISF, the importer security filing, is a post-9/11 maritime supply chain security requirement based on the following legislation: the Safe Port Act of 2006, the Trade Act of 2002, and the Transportation Security Act of 2002. Really what this comes down to is after 9/11 and the existence of ongoing threats to national security, including threats via the maritime supply chain, meaning bad people putting bad things on ships that come to the United States, the government felt justifiably that certain measures had to be taken to protect the inbound maritime supply chain. That's where all this stuff came from. And as we'll see in a moment, ISF 10+2 is about creating a digital trail of the physical whereabouts of cargo from origin and in whose hands that cargo was through the entire journey into the United States. That's all done electronically through the ISF filing. As we said, ISF is an electronic filing by the importer of record or designated agent, more on that in a second, that must take place 24 hours prior to goods being loaded on board a vessel at origin. The U.S. government does not want bad stuff getting on ships that are bound for the United States. That's why the filing has to take place 24 hours before goods are loaded on board a ship. It really doesn't help to have the ISF filed after goods are on board a ship, and especially after it's sailed. Second bullet, and this really describes the essence of what the government is trying to achieve. The required data elements represent the chain of custody of containerized cargo prior to being loaded on a ship. Where has it been? Who's had it? Who loaded it into a container? On and on. The goal is to have visibility into the origin and whereabouts of cargo to avoid acts of terror in the U.S. import maritime supply chain. As a trade tip, ISF only applies to ocean shipping. The name 10+2 is kind of morphed a little bit. It's still referred to as ISF 10+2, but a more abridged version, IFS, is also quite common and appropriate. With that said, an ISF importer must file 8 data elements 24 hours prior to goods being loaded on board a vessel at origin. The first 4 are complete seller information, full name, full address, complete buyer information, the importer of record number that we talked about so many sections ago, the consignee number, also the manufacturer or supplier, if they are different from the seller, and that can be, a seller can simply be a middle person working on behalf of a manufacturer. CBP wants to know who made the stuff and where it got made. Who's the ship to party? Second sub-bullet, the country of origin, and the commodity HTS number. Up to 6 digits, because that's how high the HTS goes. Not the HTS US number, the HTS number. As we see in our last bullet, 2 additional data elements, that's where the 10 comes in, 8+2, are required no later than 24 hours prior to a ship's arrival at a U.S. port. That's the container stuffing, location, and the consolidator, specific to LCL cargo being loaded into ocean containers. We said this previously. Let's bring a little more definition to what we're talking about. ISF importers can designate an agent to do the filing on their behalf. That's just another name for having your freight forwarder or customs broker doing it for you as a U.S. importer. Very similar, very analogous to operating as a customs broker. We say that because, as we note in our second bullet, the designated filer must have a power of attorney from the ISF importer to execute ISF filings. Just like a broker needs a power of attorney to do import work on behalf of an importer, so does a forwarder or customs broker to do ISF filings on behalf of an importer. Third bullet, importers must have a bond in place to cover ISF liabilities. And then finally, from a penalty perspective, inaccurate, incomplete, or untimely filing can result in liquidated damages of $5,000 per violation. That's going to be on the ISF filer. So some pretty stiff penalties for non-compliance. This is serious business in terms of keeping the United States safe, and the seriousness of that business is reflected in the level of penalties that are out there for non-compliance. In addition to ocean freight bound for the U.S., there are ISF requirements for shipments that transit a U.S. port. And that makes sense because there could be goods on board a vessel that stops in the United States and then continues on to other foreign or even U.S. ports, or situations where containers are offloaded from a ship and moved under an immediate export or a T&E, as we've spoken of a bunch of times. That's what we mean here. Second bullet, to summarize, there are 3 scenarios for transit cargo. FROB. That stands for freight remaining on board. So a vessel leaves the port of Yantian, comes into Long Beach, offloads a bunch of containers, but there are containers that are going to remain on board because that ship is destined for ports on the west coast of Central America and down into South America. That's just one example, but a reasonable one. The government wants to know about freight remaining on board because the ship is in a U.S. port and can do some serious damage. Second sub-bullet, goods moving under an IE must also be accounted for, that immediate export that we talked about way earlier in this module, and goods moving under a T&E, that transportation and exportation, a container offloading in LA and being transported inbound to Miami for export into Latin America. That was the actual example that we used when we talked about a T&E. All of those have to be accounted for from an ISF perspective. Under those scenarios, last bullet, there are 5 data elements required. That's why it's also known as ISF 10 plus 5. In the case of cargo transiting a U.S. port, the data element requirements are the following 5. Who was the booking party? What is the foreign port of unlading? Where is it going to for freight remaining on board? Place of delivery, the ship to party, and that 6-digit commodity HTS number. All containers have to be accounted for in the maritime supply chain, whether they're being cleared and unloaded at a U.S. port, freight remaining on board, IE containers, T&E containers, they can all contain bad stuff. And they're all, at the very least, going to be at a U.S. port, if not transiting the United States. That's why 10 plus 5 is there. Last slide in this section. This is an unofficial form example. This is not a customs form. It's actually a form that a freight forwarder put together to get information from their import customers so they can submit the ISF on their behalf. We used it here in an anonymous fashion because it just captures all of the information. Let's run through it quickly. Importer security filing, we're at the very top, starting with the lowest level AMS, Automated Manifest System BL number, the master bill, departure date, arrival date. Couple of optional items, the purchase order number, that's the purchase order from the U.S. importer on the vendor overseas. It's not needed from an ISF perspective. But in terms of data elements, we can see things like who is the ISF importer of record, full name and address, consignee, full name and address, the seller and buyer, if different from the importer of record and consignee, ship to name and address, container stuffing location, who was the consolidator, and then down below, any part number, which is optional, description, which is optional, but 8, 9, and 10, not optional, country of origin, manufacturer, supplier, if different from the seller, and the HTS 6-digit number being the lowest requirement, but up to 10 as well. Once again, this is an unofficial form. It's just a good way to visually portray what is required on an ISF filing. All right, let's take a deep breath, because we've gone through a lot of information, a lot of preparation to get to where we are now. When we come back for this section, we're going to prepare entries and present them through ACE with a couple of very nice actual examples. We'll see you on the backside.